in our new house, I woke up at 3:11 a.m. because I heard someone counting. We'd bought the place in October, a squat little 3-bedroom on a cul-de-sac that had been sitting on the market for almost a year, which should have told us something, but we were 26 and tired of renting, and the price had dropped twice. My husband, Theo, grew up 2 towns over, so the whole area felt familiar to him in a way it didn't to me. The house smelled like fresh paint over something older, cigarette smoke, maybe, baked into the drywall from decades before the last owner repainted. We joked about it. We unpacked boxes for a week straight, ate pizza off paper plates on the floor, and told each other this was the beginning of something good. The counting started low, almost under the range of hearing, like someone murmuring numbers to themselves in another room. 1, 2, 3, 4. I told myself it was the radiator, the pipes settling, the house just talking the way old houses do. We'd been warned the heating system was original to the build, whatever that meant. And I didn't ask more questions, because I didn't want the answer to cost us money we didn't have. I know I should have said something to Theo the first night I heard it, but I didn't want to be the wife who couldn't handle a new house, so I lay there counting along in my head until I fell back asleep, and in the morning I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. It happened again 2 nights later, except this time the counting didn't stop at a number and start over. It kept going, past 20, past 30, unhurried, patient, like whoever was doing it had nowhere else to be and nothing else to think about. I sat up. Theo was dead asleep beside me. The sound wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the hallway closet, the one we hadn't unpacked yet, the one still full of the previous owner's leftover shelving and a stack of paint cans nobody had picked up. I want to be honest, I didn't open it that night. I lay there with my heart going and told myself it would stop, and it did. Right around 40, right around the moment I'd started praying it would just be quiet. The next anomaly came from Theo, not me, which somehow made it worse, because he wasn't the type to invent things. He said he'd found scratches on the inside of the closet door, low, near the floor, like something had been counting them off with a fingernail. Vertical lines in groups of 5, the way you'd tally days if you didn't have a calendar. He counted them himself, out loud, and stopped at 62 before his voice actually cracked. We called the realtor. She was vague in the specific way people are vague when they know something and have decided it isn't legally required of them to say it. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that the house had been owned before the last family by a man who'd lived there alone for a long stretch, and that he'd passed away in the home, and that the family who bought it after him had sold quickly, within 18 months, for personal reasons. That was the whole sentence. For personal reasons. We didn't sleep in that bedroom again. We moved a mattress into the living room, telling ourselves it was temporary. Telling ourselves a lot of things were temporary that winter. The counting followed the mattress. Not every night. That was almost the worst part. The unpredictability. The way you'd get 4 or 5 quiet nights and start to relax, and then it would come back stronger, like it had been saving up. The last straw was the night I woke up, and the counting was right beside my ear. Not across the room. Not in the closet, beside me, low and even, counting past 100 like it had all the time in the world. And when I turned on the lamp, there was nothing there. But the air in the room was cold, in a way the thermostat couldn't explain. Cold like a door had been left open somewhere, except every door in the house was shut. We called a priest before we called a contractor, which tells you where our heads were at. He did a blessing, said some words, sprinkled water in the closet and the bedroom, and told us that whatever was here had probably been counting something specific, once, days maybe, or people, or something we'd never know. And that repetition like that, in his experience, wasn't always malicious, just stuck. That didn't comfort me the way I think he meant it to. We sold the house 11 months after we bought it, at a loss, to a couple who didn't ask many questions, and who we didn't volunteer much to, which I still feel a version of guilty about. I looked up the house online a few years later, out of a compulsion I couldn't quite explain to myself, and it had sold again. 2 more times actually in the years since. I don't know what any of those families heard. I never worked up the nerve to ask, and some nights I still catch myself, right before sleep, counting along without meaning to, like I'm still trying to find out what number it was going to stop at. I've worked hospital security for 9 years, mostly overnights, and I thought I'd heard every version of there's something in room 4B a nurse could invent to break up a slow shift. The hospital I work at now is old, 1970s bones, renovated twice, with a wing on the north side that's technically still active, but mostly used for overflow and long-term patients. Nobody visits much. Overnights are quiet there. Fluorescent lights hum, floor waxer smell lingers from the evening cleaning crew, and my job is mostly walking loops and signing badges for family members who show up at odd hours. I like the quiet. I took the job for the quiet, honestly, after a louder one burned me out. About 4 months in, a night nurse named Priya mentioned, almost in passing, that patients in room 412 kept reporting the same thing to their families before they were discharged or transferred, that someone stood at the foot of the bed at night, not doing anything, just standing there, and that the patients always described the same detail: an old cardigan, mustard yellow, buttoned wrong. I laughed it off. Hospitals are stressful, medications mess with sleep, and half the population in a long-term wing is on something that causes vivid dreaming as a listed side effect. I told her that, and she agreed with me, mostly, and we moved on. I started walking past 412 a little more on my loops anyway. Told myself it was just curiosity, a story to bring home to my wife. Nothing more than that. The room was usually occupied, usually quiet, usually exactly what you'd expect a hospital room to be at 2 a.m. Beeping monitors, low light, a shape under a blanket. The first thing that made me pause was small. A patient in 412, an elderly man recovering from a fall, waved me down one night and asked, very calmly, if I could tell his aunt to stop standing there. He didn't seem scared. He seemed mildly irritated, the way you'd be with a relative who visits too often and stands too close. I told him I'd let the nurse know, which felt like the only appropriate lie available to me at 2 a.m., and I left the room telling myself he was confused, that confusion is common in patients his age, that this meant nothing. I know it was against my better judgment, but 3 nights later I stayed in the doorway of 412 on my loop, past when I needed to, just watching. Nothing happened for almost 20 minutes. Then the patient, asleep, turned his head toward the foot of the bed, toward nothing, an empty patch of floor and a visitor's chair, and said, "Clear as anything, not tonight," and went still again. I told Priya. She didn't laugh this time. She told me the room had a reputation going back longer than her 4 years there, that other nurses avoided assigning themselves to it when they could help it, not because anything violent had ever happened, but because of a specific detail that had apparently been consistent for years across patients who'd never met each other and had no way of comparing notes. The cardigan, mustard yellow, buttoned wrong. I looked into the room's history the way you're not really supposed to as security staff, pulling old maintenance logs more than patient records since I didn't have access to anything real. What I found was a note, years old, about a mold remediation in that room, and a mention in an even older log of a patient incident with no further detail. The kind of vague hospital paperwork that exists specifically, so nobody has to write down what actually happened. The worst night was the one where I was doing my loop and heard, from inside 412, two voices, the patient's, and a second one, lower, unhurried. The words unclear, but the rhythm distinctly like a conversation, not a monologue. I opened the door. The patient was alone, awake, staring at the foot of the bed, with an expression I can only describe as tired, like he was midway through arguing with someone he'd argued with 100 times before. He looked at me and said, "She wants to know if I've finished my sweater." And then, quieter, almost apologetic, "I never did learn to knit." I filed an incident report that didn't use the word I wanted to use. I described it as a patient experiencing confusion consistent with his diagnosis, because that's the version of the truth that keeps my job. Administration never followed up beyond a form email thanking me for flagging patient welfare concerns. The patient was discharged 2 weeks later, and I never found out where he went, or whether the standing figure went with him, or stayed behind for whoever came next. I still walk that loop. I still pass 412 slower than the others. I've never seen the cardigan myself, and some nights I'm grateful for that, and some nights, if I'm honest, I almost wish I had, just so I'd finally know what I was avoiding. I buy furniture at estate sales and flip it, which is how a mirror with no visible flaws and a price tag of $8 ended up in the back of my car on a Saturday in March. I'd been doing this part-time for about 2 years, enough to know what to look for and what to skip. The estate sale was out past the edge of town, a farmhouse that had belonged to a woman in her 90s who died without much family left to claim things. So the whole contents of the house were laid out on folding tables like a museum nobody curated. Most of it was junk. The mirror stood out, full-length, oak frame, the glass slightly wavy in the way old glass gets. No cracks, no fogging, just genuinely well made. $8 felt like a mistake in my favor. I got it home, cleaned the frame, and set it up in my spare room where I photograph pieces before listing them online. The first oddity was so small, I almost didn't register it as odd at all. In the photos, my reflection's timing was off. Not by much. A half-second lag between when I moved and when the reflection caught up. The kind of thing you'd blame on a slow camera app if you weren't looking closely, which I wasn't at first. I told myself it was the phone. Old phones lag, cheap apps lag, and I had both. I kept photographing pieces in that room for another week, without thinking much more about it, though I noticed I'd started angling the mirror away from my desk, without really deciding to. The thing that actually got my attention against my better judgment was catching. In one photo I'd taken of a dresser, a shape in the mirror's reflection that didn't match the room. The dresser was in front of the mirror, at an angle, and the mirror should have shown the dresser and the wall behind me. Instead, it showed something like a doorway, dark, that didn't exist anywhere in my actual house. I zoomed in more times than I want to admit. It was probably a shadow. I told myself it was probably a shadow. I started sleeping worse around then, though I didn't connect it to the mirror at first, just chalked it up to work stress, bad coffee timing, the usual excuses. Then my dog, who'd never once cared about any piece of furniture I'd brought home, started refusing to enter the spare room at all, standing in the doorway and growling low at nothing I could see, always aimed at the same corner where the mirror stood. The second, worse anomaly came at night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the spare room door, which I'd left shut, standing open, and a sound coming from inside like fabric being dragged slowly across wood. I stood in the hallway for what felt like 10 minutes before I made myself look. The mirror had been turned, physically turned, to face the door, when I distinctly remembered angling it toward the wall before bed. I don't own a version of myself brave enough to explain that away as sleepwalking, though I tried. I did some digging on the house it came from, not hard. Small towns keep records, and small town people keep memories longer than the records do. The woman who died had inherited the mirror from her own mother, and there was a story, half joke, half warning, that the neighbors told about it, that the mirror had belonged, before that, to a house that burned down 2 counties over in the 1950s, and that it was the only thing pulled out intact, and that nobody in that family would say why they'd let it go instead of keeping it. I didn't wait for a climax I could survive telling you about. I put the mirror back in my car the next morning and drove it to a donation center 40 minutes away, not the one near me, somewhere far enough that I couldn't easily go back for it if I changed my mind out of curiosity. I told the woman at the counter it was in perfect condition, which was true, and I didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else I could prove. My dog stopped growling at empty doorways within a week. I still don't know what that mirror actually was, or what it had seen in that farmhouse, or in the house before it that burned. I looked up the donation center once, months later, just to see if the mirror had resold. It wasn't listed. I don't know if that means someone bought it, or if someone behind the counter took one look at it and made a different decision than I did. I hosted the graveyard shift on a small AM station for 3 years, the kind of station that plays cool in shows to an audience of insomniacs and truckers, and I want to tell you about the night a caller's voice came through the board before the caller had actually connected. The station was housed in a converted ranch house on the edge of town, repurposed decades ago, still smelling faintly of the family that used to live there, under all the cable runs and soundproofing foam. I worked alone most nights, just me and a producer named Diane, who monitored calls from a cubicle down the hall. It was a quiet job. I liked the quiet. Most nights the biggest excitement was a caller wanting to talk about UFOs or a trucker wanting company on a long haul. The first strange thing happened on an ordinary Tuesday. I was mid-broadcast, no calls queued, just playing a stretch of music, when I heard, faintly, under the song, a voice saying my name. Not through the headphones exactly, more like it bled in from somewhere else in the signal chain, low and staticky. Gone as soon as I focused on it. I figured it was crosstalk, some kind of signal bleed from another frequency, which happens more than you'd think with old equipment. I made a note to have the board looked at and didn't think much more of it. It happened again 2 nights later, except this time it wasn't just my name. It was a full sentence, garbled, but with the cadence of someone speaking normally, cutting in for maybe 2 seconds during a song break before vanishing back into static. I played back the recording afterward, over and over, and could never quite make out the words, though every time I listened I became more convinced I recognized the voice, and could never place from where. I know I should have just called it equipment trouble and left it there, but I started staying later after my shift ended, alone in the booth, trying to catch it again on purpose, which in hindsight was not a great decision for someone working alone in a converted house at 4 a.m. The escalation came when Diane heard it too, independently, without me mentioning anything to her first. She buzzed into my headset mid-song, asking who I'd let into the booth, because she'd seen, on the hallway camera feed she monitored, someone standing just outside the studio door, a shape, she said, that didn't move like it was breathing, there and then not there, between one frame of the feed and the next. I checked the door. No one was there. No one had signed in at the front desk, which locked automatically after 10 p.m. and required a code. The worst night was the one where the voice came through clear, mid-broadcast, live, audible to anyone listening on their radio at home, not just to me. It said one sentence, distinctly, in a voice that Diane later swore matched no one on staff, current or former, that either of us could identify. I used to sit right where you're sitting. We got 4 calls in the next 10 minutes from listeners asking what that was, if it was a bit, if it was a promo for something. I told them technical difficulties. I didn't have a better answer to give. We had an engineer come check the board the next week. He found nothing wrong with the equipment, no crossed wires, no interference source, nothing that could explain a full sentence bleeding into a live broadcast. He did mention, almost as a throwaway, that the ranch house the station was built into had a previous owner, decades back, who died in what was now the break room, and that some of the older staff used to joke about it before he'd been hired, though nobody took it seriously enough to write down the details. I left that job about 8 months later, for reasons I told people were about pay and hours, which was true, but not the whole truth. I still listen to that station sometimes, late at night, out of habit more than anything. I've never heard the voice again on the recordings I still have saved. I don't know if that means it stopped, or if it just found someone else's shift to sit in on. I do renovation work, mostly old houses, and the farmhouse job I took last spring is the reason I now always ask a client, up front, whether anyone's died in the house before I agree to a contract. The house belonged to a young family who'd bought it as a fixer-upper, cheap, with plans to restore the original woodwork and open up the kitchen. My job was mostly structural, load-bearing walls, foundation work, the unglamorous stuff nobody photographs for renovation shows. The house was genuinely beautiful under the neglect. Wide plank floors, a staircase with hand-carved balusters. The kind of craftsmanship you don't see in new builds anymore. I liked working there. The clients were easy, the pay was good, and for the first 2 weeks nothing about the job stood out at all. The first odd thing was the temperature in the upstairs hallway, which stayed noticeably colder than every other room no matter what I did with the FAC, even after I checked the ductwork twice and found nothing wrong. I chalked it up to poor insulation, which was a reasonable explanation in a 100-year-old farmhouse, and moved on with the job. Then I found the door. Behind a section of drywall I was tearing out on the second floor, there was a second door, older than the surrounding structure, painted over so many times it had sealed itself shut, leading to a room that didn't appear on any floor plan the family had been given when they bought the house. I know I should have stopped and called the client immediately, but curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open myself before telling anyone. The room inside was small, maybe 6 feet by 8, empty except for a child's rocking chair, undamaged, sitting in the exact center of the floor like someone had placed it there on purpose and then sealed the room around it. There was no dust on it. Every other surface in that hidden room was thick with a century of dust. The chair was clean. I called the client that afternoon. She hadn't known the room existed, and neither had the previous owners she'd spoken to during the sale, or so they'd told her. What she did know, and hadn't mentioned before, was that the house had a local reputation, something her realtor had downplayed at closing, that a child had died there decades earlier, in what the Historical Society's old records vaguely called a household accident, with no further detail available, the kind of phrasing that exists to close a door on a story instead of telling it. The chair started rocking on its own 2 nights after I found it. Not dramatically. A slow, steady rock, the kind a chair does when someone's sitting in it, distracted, listening to something. The client's older daughter, 6 years old, told her mother matter-of-factly that she'd made a new friend in the hallway who liked to be sung to, and could she leave the light on for her at night. The mother, to her credit, didn't panic in front of the kid. She panicked on the phone with me instead, which I understood completely. We finished the structural work as fast as we responsibly could. I sealed the hidden room back up at the client's request, chair and all, though not before a local priest came through and blessed the space, which the client insisted on, and I didn't argue with. The daughter stopped mentioning her new friend within a couple of weeks of the room being resealed, though she asked about her once months later, out of nowhere, at dinner, and the mother told me she'd had to leave the table. I finished the job. I got paid. I don't do work in houses over 80 years old anymore without a direct conversation about the property's history first. And I don't care how it sounds when I ask. I never found out the name of the child who died there, or exactly what happened, and neither did the family, as far as I know. Some historical records just don't want to be found, and after that job, I've stopped trying to find them. I took the overnight security job at a small regional history museum because it paid better than retail, and I figured nothing exciting ever happens in a building full of pioneer farm equipment and old photographs. The museum was housed in a converted 1800s manor that the county had acquired decades ago. All original woodwork, creaky floors, the kind of building that makes noise constantly, just from temperature changes, which the training manager warned me about on my first night so I wouldn't call in a false alarm over settling. I appreciated the warning. It meant I didn't panic the first few times I heard the floors groan on my rounds. About 6 weeks in, on a slow Tuesday overnight, I noticed one of the exhibit cases in the second-floor hallway, a collection of Victorian-era mourning jewellery, hair lockets and the like, which I found a little morbid but otherwise unremarkable, had fogged glass in the morning, like breath had been on it, despite the case being sealed and climate-controlled. I mentioned it to the day staff, who told me it happened sometimes with older cases and humidity fluctuations, and I accepted that because it was a reasonable, boring explanation, and I wanted a reasonable, boring explanation. It kept happening though, always on the same case, always overnight, never during the day. I started timing my rounds to pass that hallway more slowly, telling myself it was just professional thoroughness, though I think some part of me already knew that wasn't the whole reason. The first real anomaly came with sound. I heard, faintly, from that same hallway, something that took me a full minute to identify as humming. A slow, mournful little melody, unfamiliar, repeating every few bars like the person doing it had forgotten the rest. I checked every room on that floor, empty. I checked the exterior cameras. No entry, no exit, nothing on the feed except me, walking the hallway alone, audibly nervous on my own body cam footage, which I've watched back more times than I'd like to admit. I know it was against every piece of training I'd received, but I started staying in that hallway longer on purpose, trying to catch whatever it was in the act, instead of just reporting it up the chain like I was supposed to. The escalation happened on a night in February. I was standing near the morning jewellery case when the temperature dropped hard enough that I could see my breath, indoors, in a climate-controlled museum, and the humming started again. Closer this time, close enough that I felt certain, with total irrational conviction, that if I turned around, I'd see someone standing directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I walked, fast, not quite running, to the stairwell, and I radioed the off-site monitoring company to ask if anyone else had entered the building. Nobody had. I did some research on the case's contents afterward, on my own time, since the museum staff weren't especially forthcoming about individual pieces. One locket in that case according to a placard I'd walked past 100 times without reading closely. Belonged to a woman who had lost a young daughter to illness in the 1880s and had reportedly worn the locket containing a lock of the child's hair every day for the rest of her own life. Decades. Until she died. The locket had been donated to the museum by a descendant 3 generations later, along with a note displayed beside it that the family had specifically asked to be included, that the mother, in her final years, had reportedly still been heard humming a lullaby to no one in an empty room every night before bed. I asked to be reassigned to a different floor. My supervisor didn't ask why, which told me I wasn't the first guard to make that request, though nobody would confirm that directly. I still hear, some nights on rounds through other parts of the building, something that might be humming carried faintly through old plaster walls. And I've made peace with not checking anymore. I don't know what she's still humming to, all these years later, and there's a version of me that hopes I never find out, and a version that still, quietly, wants to. I've driven long haul for 11 years, and I want to tell you about the passenger who got into my cab at a rest stop outside a town so small it didn't have its own exit sign. It was late, close to 1 a.m., a stretch of highway I'd driven probably 200 times without incident. I'd pulled off to sleep for a few hours before my next delivery window, parked among a dozen other rigs in a lot that was well lit but mostly empty of people. I remember the weather specifically because it was unseasonably warm for the time of year, humid in a way that made the whole lot smell like wet asphalt and diesel. I woke up around 2:30 because someone was knocking, politely, on my passenger door. A woman, maybe 30, dressed a little light for the temperature, said she'd been in an accident up the road and asked if she could sit in the cab and warm up while she waited for someone to come get her. This happens sometimes, more than people realize. Stranded travelers, hitchhikers, people in genuinely bad situations. And I've helped people before without incident. So I let her in. That was the first small decision I'd end up thinking about a lot afterward. She sat quietly for a while, thanked me, said her name was Renee, and made small talk about the drive, about where I was headed. Nothing unusual. The first thing that struck me as slightly off was that she never once looked cold, despite the light clothing and the story about being stranded, and that her phone, which she'd mentioned using to call for a ride, never once buzzed or lit up sitting in her lap. I know I should have just called it in to dispatch right then and asked for a ride to be sent from a real number. But I didn't want to be rude to someone who might genuinely be having the worst night of her life, so I let it go and offered to drive her to the nearest gas station myself instead. She declined, gently, and asked instead if I'd mind just sitting with her a while longer, since she said she got nervous being alone after what had happened. We talked for maybe 20 more minutes. She asked about my family, my route, whether I got lonely out here. And there was something about the questions. Too specific. Too patient. Like she already had answers in mind and was just confirming them. That started to sit wrong with me in a way I couldn't articulate at the time. The escalation happened when I glanced down to check my phone for the time and looked back up to find the passenger seat empty. No door had opened. I would have heard it, would have felt the change in cab pressure, the way you always do in a rig. The door was locked, the way I'd left it. She was simply gone, in the 2 or 3 seconds my eyes had been down. I sat there for a long time before I did anything. When I finally got the nerve to check outside, the lot was as empty and quiet as it had been before. No sign of any accident up the road, no other travelers, nothing. I called it in anyway, told dispatch and later a highway patrol officer what happened. more out of a need to say it out loud to someone than any real expectation they'd find anything. The officer took my statement politely and told me, in a tone I recognized as someone being kind rather than someone believing me, that there'd been no accidents reported on that stretch that night and no missing persons matching that description in the area. He did mention, almost as an afterthought before he left, that other truckers had reported similar things at that same rest stop over the years. A woman, similar description, similar story, similar sudden absence. Enough times that some of the regular drivers had started avoiding an overnight stop there altogether. I still drive that route sometimes, because the job doesn't leave much room for rerouting around a story nobody can confirm. I don't park at that particular rest stop anymore if I can help it. I never found out who Renee was, or wasn't, or what happened to make her stop there before me, and after 11 years on the road. That's the one thing out there I've decided I'd genuinely rather not learn the answer to. I moved into a basement apartment in a converted duplex because it was the only thing in my price range near the university, and the landlord seemed nice enough not to ask too many questions when I toured it at noon on a Saturday. It was a small unit, 1 bedroom, low ceilings. The kind of place where you learn to duck without thinking about it after the first week. The building was older, converted from a single-family home sometime in the 1960s, according to the landlord, with the upstairs unit rented separately to a family I rarely saw. I moved in during August, right before the semester started, excited mostly about having my own space for the first time, and not thinking much about the building's age, beyond noting it kept the rent low. The first strange thing was the sound of footsteps directly above my bedroom, late at night, pacing in a slow, even line back and forth, at hours when I knew the upstairs family was asleep, since I'd hear their actual movements at more normal times, and this wasn't that. I told myself it was probably one of them up with insomnia, or a kid sneaking around after bedtime, and left it alone, because it wasn't really any of my business what my upstairs neighbors did at night. It kept happening though, at almost exactly the same time each night, close to 1 a.m., consistent enough that I started to notice the pattern, even though I was actively trying not to. I asked the upstairs neighbor about it once, casually, framing it as a joke about hearing footsteps, and she looked at me for a beat too long before saying that nobody in her family walked around that late, and that she'd actually meant to ask me the same question, because she sometimes heard the exact same sound coming from below, from my apartment, when she knew I was out. I know I should have taken that more seriously than I did, but it was midterms. I was exhausted, and it was easier to file it away as a weird coincidence than to actually sit with what she'd said. The escalation came when I started noticing the pacing sync up with something else, a faint smell, briefly, of pipe tobacco, gone as quickly as it arrived, in an apartment where nobody smoked, and the building had a strict no-smoking policy that the landlord enforced aggressively. I looked into the building's history out of a mounting unease I couldn't quite justify to myself, and found, through an old local newspaper archive I accessed at the university library, that the original owner of the house, decades before it was converted into a duplex, had been a man who'd lived there alone for the last years of his life after his wife's death. Reportedly pacing the floors nightly, smoking a pipe, a habit several neighbors at the time had mentioned in passing to a reporter covering an unrelated story about the block. The worst night was the one where the pacing stopped directly above my bed, mid-stride, and stayed stopped, silent, for almost a full minute, before a single, deliberate step sounded right above where my head was, like something had leaned down to check on me before moving on. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my kitchen with every light on until the sun came up. I told the landlord, who didn't seem surprised so much as resigned, and admitted, when I pushed, that previous tenants in that basement unit had mentioned similar things, though he'd always assumed it was old building noise and hadn't thought it worth bringing up during a lease signing. I broke my lease early, ate the fee, and moved into a dorm the following semester, which felt like a step backward at the time, but which I've never regretted since. I don't know if the pacing ever stopped for the tenant who moved in after me, or if it's still going. Every night around 1 a.m., in an apartment I try very hard not to think about. I looked up the building once, a year later. It was for rent again. I didn't call. My grandmother left me her house when she passed, a modest 2-story place she'd lived in for over 50 years, and I want to tell you about the week I spent there alone, sorting through her things, before I understood why none of my cousins had volunteered to help. I'd always loved that house as a kid, full of the specific comfort only a grandparent's home can hold. The smell of her cooking baked permanently into the kitchen walls, the creak of the 3rd stair that I could still predict from memory. Staying there after she passed felt less like a chore and more like a chance to say goodbye slowly, on my own terms, instead of all at once at the funeral. I told my family I'd handle the estate sorting myself. I wanted the quiet. The first few nights were fine, sad, but ordinary, full of the kind of grief that comes in waves while you're folding someone's sweaters into donation boxes. The first odd thing I noticed was small, a music box in her bedroom, one I remembered from childhood, that I was certain I'd wound down and closed the lid on before bed, open and playing faintly the next morning. I told myself I must have misremembered closing it, that grief makes you forgetful, and moved on. It happened again 2 nights later, the same tune, playing at a volume that felt deliberately calibrated to wake me, rather than to simply be audible. And this time I was certain, absolutely certain, that I'd closed the lid. I know I should have just left the house and finished the sorting during the day only, but something about being there at night felt important to me in a way I couldn't fully explain, like I owed her more time than daylight hours alone would give us, so I stayed. Against what I now recognize was pretty clear judgment to leave. The escalation came when I started smelling her perfume, distinct, specific, a scent I hadn't encountered anywhere since her funeral, drifting through rooms she wasn't in when she was alive nearly as often. The garage, the basement, rooms I associated more with my grandfather, who'd passed years before her. It would arrive suddenly and vanish just as fast, always when I was alone, never when a cousin dropped by briefly to grab a keepsake. The night that changed things, I was in the basement going through old photo albums when I heard, clearly, from directly behind me, my name, said the exact way she used to say it, with the particular emphasis she always put on the second syllable that nobody else in the family replicated quite right. I turned around. Nothing, but the air held her perfume so strongly for a moment that my eyes actually watered, and then it was gone, all at once, like a door closing somewhere. I called my mother the next morning, shaken, and she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before telling me something she said she'd been debating whether to mention at all. That in the last year of her life, my grandmother had become convinced that my grandfather was still in the house with her and had taken to talking to him in empty rooms, setting out his coffee cup in the mornings, out of habit she couldn't break, and that the family had quietly agreed not to make a thing of it, chalking it up to grief and age, and had never really discussed it since. I finished sorting the house over the following 2 weeks, during daylight hours only, as much as I could manage. I never smelt her perfume again after that basement night, and I've wondered since whether that was her finally moving on, or whether it was something else entirely that had simply gotten what it wanted from me and lost interest. The music box sold at the estate sale to a stranger I never met. I think about it sometimes, wonder if it still plays on its own in whatever house it ended up in, and whether the person who bought it has any idea what they brought home for $8 or whatever it went for. I never asked the final price. Some things I decided I'd rather not know. I worked the overnight desk at a roadside motel for 2 years, the kind of place with an ice machine that never worked right and a neon sign missing its middle letter. And I want to tell you about room 114, which we stopped renting out about 6 months before I quit. The motel had been built in the 1960s and hadn't changed much since, aside from a paint job every decade or so, and a slow rotation of owners who mostly kept the same staff. My job overnight was simple: check in the occasional late arrival, answer the phone, keep an eye on the parking lot. Most nights were uneventful in the specific, boring way that made the job easy to zone out through. Room 114 was on the ground floor, end of the building, closest to the highway, which made it popular with truckers wanting an easy exit in the morning. The first thing I noticed, gradually, over my first few months, was that guests in 114 checked out early with unusual frequency, always polite about it, always vague, citing things like couldn't get comfortable or noisy pipes in a building where I personally knew the pipes for that room ran nowhere near the guest side of the wall. I chalked it up to a bad mattress, made a note to ask the owner about replacing it, and didn't think much more of it at the time. It became harder to explain away when a guest, a woman traveling alone, came to the desk at 4 a.m. asking, very calmly, if there was another room available. Because someone kept sitting on the edge of her bed, I offered her 116 instead, no charge for the switch, and didn't ask follow-up questions, because in my experience by that point, guests who saw something rarely wanted to describe it twice. I know I should have brought this up with the owner sooner than I did, but the motel was already struggling financially, and I didn't want to be the employee who made things harder by suggesting we had a haunted room, so I kept quiet and kept switching guests out of 114 whenever they asked, without explanation, and hoped nobody higher up would notice the pattern. The escalation came on a night I was doing my own walkthrough of the property, checking that all the room doors were properly latched, and found the door to 114 standing open, though it had been rented that evening, and the guest's car was still in the lot. I called out, got no answer, and stepped inside to find the room empty, the bed made, untouched. Despite the guest having checked in hours earlier with a duffel bag, I distinctly remembered seeing him carry in. He turned up an hour later, walking in from the direction of the highway on foot, badly shaken, and told me, once he'd calmed down enough to speak clearly, that he'd woken up standing outside the motel with no memory of leaving his room, and that the last thing he remembered before that was a voice, close to his ear, asking him if he wanted to see something. He checked out immediately, didn't ask for a refund, didn't want one, just wanted to leave. I did some digging afterward, mostly out of my own unease, and found through an old employee who'd worked there decades earlier that a man had died in 114 in the 1980s, alone, of causes the old-timer either didn't know or didn't want to specify, and that the room had developed a quiet reputation among staff even back then, one that had apparently just kept getting passed down through generations of overnight clerks without ever making it into any official record. We stopped renting 114 out not long after that, officially citing plumbing issues that never got scheduled for repair, unofficially because none of us wanted to keep explaining ourselves to guests who left in the middle of the night. I don't know what happened to that room after the motel eventually changed hands again, whether the new owners ever reopened it or ever found out why it had been closed. I never went back to check, and I've never regretted not knowing. My partner and I rented a cabin for a long weekend to get away from the city, the kind of last-minute booking you make because a listing looks charming and the price drops right before checkout closes. And I want to tell you what happened on our second night there. In a cabin that had clearly been standing much longer than the listing photos let on. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, no other properties visible from the porch, surrounded by enough tree cover that cell service dropped to nothing about a mile before we arrived. We loved that about it. At first, the isolation felt like the whole point of the trip. The owner had left a folder of local recommendations and a handwritten note welcoming us, along with an odd little detail we didn't think much of at check-in. A small brass bell hanging by the back door, with a note beneath it that just said, "Ring if you need to." No further explanation offered. The first night passed without incident, aside from the ordinary unfamiliar creaks of an old structure settling around us as we slept. The second night, I woke up to the bell ringing once, faint, from the back door, at almost exactly 2 a.m. I assumed it was wind, though I couldn't recall the back door having any gap wide enough to let a draft move something that heavy, and went back to sleep without waking my partner. It happened again the following night, except this time my partner heard it too, and neither of us could explain it away as convincingly the second time, since the air outside had gone completely still by then. No wind at all, confirmed by a quick look at the weather app before our phones lost signal for the night. I know it was against our better judgment, but instead of just ignoring it and going back to sleep, we got up and checked the back door together and found it locked exactly as we'd left it, the bell hanging motionless, cold to the touch in a way that felt slightly wrong compared to the room's temperature around it. The next morning, unsettled but not wanting to cut the trip short over what still felt explainable, we found the cabin's guestbook tucked in a drawer and read through a few entries out of curiosity. Buried among ordinary notes about hiking trails and good breakfast spots in town, we found several entries, spaced years apart, mentioning the same bell, always ringing at night, always around the same hour, always with the guests noting they'd found the door locked afterward. One entry, older than the rest, mentioned that it had rung for someone again the night before, and the writer hoped she'd find who she was looking for soon. The worst moment came on our final night, when the bell rang 3 times in quick succession. Urgent in a way the previous nights hadn't been, followed by a sound from just outside the back door that I can only describe as someone exhaling. Close, right against the wood. My partner grabbed my hand in the dark, and neither of us said anything for a long time, just listened until it stopped as suddenly as it started. We asked the owner about it at checkout, carefully, framing it as curiosity about the guestbook entries, rather than admitting how shaken we actually were. She hesitated, then told us, in the tone of someone who'd clearly had this conversation before and never fully gotten comfortable with it, that the cabin had belonged to her grandparents, and that her grandmother had died there, waiting for her grandfather to return from a hunting trip he never came back from, and that the bell had been her grandmother's, originally used to call him in for dinner. She said she'd kept it up out of sentiment more than anything, and had never quite decided whether she believed the stories other guests told her, though she admitted she'd stopped booking the cabin out during the specific week of the year her grandfather had gone missing. We didn't ask what week that was. We paid, thanked her, and drove the hour back to cell service in near total silence. I still don't know if the bell rings for every guest or just some of them, or what exactly it is that's still listening for an answer at the back door of that cabin, decades on. looked the listing up again a while later, thinking about whether to warn future guests somehow in a review. In the end, I didn't write one at all. I still don't know what I would have said. That's where I'll leave it for tonight. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through all of it. Close your eyes, let the rain do the rest, and I'll have more of these waiting for you next time.